Hey, welcome back. In our previous session, we looked at the question of whether the stories about the life of Jesus changed in that period of verbal transmission before they were formally written down. And we've answered those. We said, look, the time gap's too small. We said the authors were eyewitnesses, and we said that there's no evidence of non-miraculous stories anywhere that have been found, so why would we doubt those things? And so they're the answers to address this issue of myth. But they, of course, don't address the issue of lies. What if the disciples just simply made it up, even claiming to be eyewitnesses, but they were lying for some sort of gain and so on? So that's the next thing we got to address. It's a different question, so we've got to find different answers, although one or two of them do overlap. So how do we know they weren't lying? Well, the first one is the same answers. One of the answers for the issue of myth is that the Gospels were written in the lifetime of eyewitnesses. And so, let's talk about that resurrection just very quickly again. If Jesus never really rose from the dead, but the disciples lied about this, the fact they were preaching this and then writing it down formally within 20 to 30 years of the events, there would still be people who were alive who had a vested interest in this to show that this story wasn't true. And specifically, it was the Jewish leaders of the time. They were fanatical about trying to stop the spread of Christianity. And if Jesus had not risen from the dead, then his body would still be in the grave, and they would have been able to pull that body out, and Christianity would have been shut down overnight. But they couldn't because the tomb was empty. That's proof the tomb was empty because no one was able to produce the body. And so in terms of claiming a resurrection, we know that the tomb must have at least been empty. In terms of, I suppose that doesn't answer that they might have stolen the body, and that we'll address that in a minute. But in terms of Jesus doing miracles as well, if Jesus never did any miracles, then people around at the time that these were right and would say, no, we never remember anyone being healed and so on. So again, written within the time of the life of eyewitnesses would have stamped out Christianity if these stories were not true. Secondly, the Gospels contain embarrassing information, and that's important because it has a sense of a ring of truth. And, if lawyers will tell us this, judges will tell us this, that if you're in a law court and all the witnesses' stories match up exactly perfectly, and it's a very polished sort of stories, then people usually go, these witnesses have colluded. They've thought about what they're going to say, and they've put the best foot forward, if you like, and created a version of events that's more acceptable to the hearers and so on. But when you do read true stories, sometimes there are events that just don't make sense. Or don't put the authors in the best possible light. And we find that in the Gospels, that things that the authors included, if you were making the stories up, you probably wouldn't include them this way or say them this way, because they include them and they raise problems, they raise questions to us. And so if you were just making it up, you wouldn't include those things. So let's look at some of those things that probably you wouldn't put in if you were making up the story. And so, for example, Mark 6 tells us that Jesus, when he went to Nazareth, his hometown, he could do no miracles. Now, that's a drama. If Jesus really was the Son of God and so on, then why could he not do miracles there? Well, the Gospels do explain that, but really, if they were making this up, it'd be better just not to include that. So they include it. Why? Because that's what actually happened, and they wanted to be honest and truthful to the events. Secondly, Jesus is recorded as not knowing everything. Now, he's God, and therefore he should know all things. But clearly he says there in Mark again, 13, and in the other Gospels, he didn't know the time of his second coming, which again, if you were making this story up, you probably wouldn't put that in. It has the ring of truth, however, that, it gives us a question, well, how come Jesus didn't know these things? It must have happened, otherwise they would not have put that in there. Jesus on the cross declared he was forsaken by God. That gives us all sorts of theological problems of how could that happen if he really was a member of the Trinity. The fourth point, I like this one, is that they record that the first witnesses to see the resurrection were not the main leaders amongst the disciples, but in fact women. And you've got to understand, in their culture, women were not regarded as accurate witnesses and so on. They were not educated. They were regarded as talebearers and so on. And so the fact that the gospel authors record that women of all people were the first to see the resurrected Jesus is not the thing you would make up if you could write whatever you wanted to, if you were lying, but it happened, they wrote it down, and it gave them a problem, but nonetheless they wrote it down because that's actually what happened. Again, we could go on with lots of other examples. The disciples, who are the heroes of the story, are repeatedly portrayed as not having a clue about what Jesus is saying or doing. And over and over again says they did not understand, they did not understand, they did not understand. And even to the point of the resurrection, Jesus tells them very plainly many times, we're going to Jerusalem, I'm going to be arrested, I'm going to be killed, but I will rise again. And when it began to happen, they seemed to have no idea. They ran for cover, they hid. And even when there were stories circulating now that Jesus has risen, they doubted the women, even so much so Thomas later on doubts all the other 11 disciples or 10 at that stage. No, I will not believe this. They were people who didn't understand. It gives us the ring of truth. They're supposed to be the heroes, yet they don't seem to have faith. They're presented, also the disciples are presented as being ambitious, wanting to sit on the left and right hand of Jesus in the kingdom. They're presented as being unloving and judgmental. They're wanting to come on fire down on Samaritans for not putting Jesus and the disciples up overnight. They are disloyal to him. They flee at the time of the arrest and so on. They're unbelieving at the resurrection and so on. So again, this all brings in a ring of truth. Now, there's not a rock solid proof that they're not lying. If you're a very clever author, you could probably make those up and bring the ring of truth into it. But you can see it the other way, that it actually has the ring of truth because it is the truth. I do like these next two arguments, so I think they're the strongest. The third is the authors were actually changed by their belief in a resurrection. If they had lied about the resurrection, then we wouldn't have seen that transformation we see in their lives from being timid people on the run, hiding from the Jewish authorities, to now standing up boldly in front of the very people who had only days before been demanding the death of Jesus. Now Peter stands up and says, you crucified him, you need to repent. And there's a transformation that shows that Peter really believed in what he was saying. But the biggest proof above all is our last point here, is that the authors of the Gospels died for their belief in who Jesus was, and specifically died for their belief in the resurrection of Jesus. And I've got the account of each of the disciples there and their deaths, but the ones of interest to us are Matthew. He was run through, is speared to death in Egypt. Mark was burned to death in Egypt. Luke was hanged in Greece. And John, although not killed, he was actually, they attempted to kill him, I understand, by boiling him in oil. He survived that and then was exiled in Patmos. Man, just think about this. If you had lied about the resurrection of Jesus, you might get some sort of prominence and gain and fame or whatever while you're alive. But if it comes to the point that they're going to put you to death because you're proclaiming that Jesus rose from the dead, it's at that point you've got nothing else to gain. It's at that point, if you know that you're lying, you would turn around and say, no, it's not true, spare my life, please. And so we know that no one dies for something they know is a lie. And that's the biggest proof to tell us that the disciples were sincerely convinced of the truth of what they were saying. So how do we know that the accounts are not lies? Well, we've got these four arguments. One is the events were written in the lifetime of eyewitnesses who could have refuted the events if they'd not been true. The Gospels have a ring of truth to them in that they contain embarrassing information. Thirdly, the disciples or the authors were transformed by their belief. And most importantly, the authors were willing to die, and in fact did die, for their belief in a resurrection. Now, of course, remember at the start of our first session, I said, you've got to know what questions you're being asked to find out the answers that are relevant. So we're addressing here, how do we know the disciples are not lying? And the biggest argument here is, well, you are not willing to die for something you know is a lie. You must be convinced of its truth. But we need to look at the next issue is, well, maybe they were not lying, but maybe they were mistaken, because sadly, around the world, even today, there are people who are willing to die for their religious beliefs. And we would think they're wrong in some of their beliefs, but they are willing to die for them because they believe those beliefs are true. But we would believe they're mistaken. But can you see the difference here is that to them, they believe it's true, so they're willing to die. So how do we know that's not the case of the disciples, that they're not lying about it, but they were just mistaken? And if they were mistaken, they sincerely believed it to be true, therefore they'd be willing to die for it. So it's a different argument which needs different answers. I hope you're following my logic there. So what are the evidences to show they weren't mistaken? Now, to answer that, you've got to look at specific accounts in the Gospels and say, well, this is what the eyewitnesses recorded, but could they have jumped to the wrong conclusion about what they saw? And, and so, for example, the tomb of Jesus was empty, and so they wrongly assumed there'd been a resurrection. And so they now believe Jesus had risen from the dead, where in fact, no, there was another reason why the tomb was empty and so on. So we need to look at those evidences or those specific situations and see, could it be true that the disciples were mistaken? So that's what we're going to look at. And so we're going to look at the resurrection of Jesus, and this is a really important issue. Some would say amongst Christianity that it doesn't matter that Jesus did miracles or not. It doesn't matter whether he rose from the dead or not. But no, that's ill-informed. It's of vital importance. If Jesus did not rise from the dead, Paul says here, he says, then our Christianity is in vain. He says that if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, then we've got no hope for our own resurrection and so on. And so Paul makes gives us no room to escape here. He's saying that if there's no resurrection, there's no Christianity. This is a key issue. And so again, Jesus himself said he would rise from the dead in Matthew 28:18. And so if Jesus hadn't risen from the dead, Jesus was a false prophet himself, and he was deluded and so on. And Paul goes on to say in Romans 1 that the resurrection of Jesus proves that Jesus is in fact the Son of God. Let me read that one to you. Concerning his son, Paul says, who was descended from David according to the flesh, verse 4 says, and was declared to be the Son of God in power according to the Spirit of holiness. How was he declared to be the Son of God? By his resurrection from the dead. This is Jesus Christ our Lord. And so, but Paul is saying on the New Testament gives us no option other to say, if we can disprove the resurrection, then there is no Christianity. So what are some of the arguments used to suggest the disciples came to a wrong conclusion about the resurrection? The first theory we're going to look at is called the swoon theory. And this theory essentially says that Jesus, being scourged and then crucified, actually was taken off the cross too early. And he wasn't actually dead, but the disciples and the soldiers who were, not living in a scientific age, thought Jesus had died. Maybe he'd gone, as the name suggested, gone into a swoon, or we'd say a coma nowadays. He'd gone into a coma, his heartbeat had dropped right down to, it was almost, imperceivable and so on. They thought he was dead. They put him in the tomb, but in the tomb, Jesus then revived. He's not resurrected. He was never dead. But now he's recovered from this coma or this swoon and gets out of the tomb and presents himself to the disciples who, having wrongly believed he had died, now come to a wrong conclusion that he must have risen from the dead. And so now they're willing to die for this because they believe it with all their heart, but they're mistaken. It wasn't a resurrection, it was a revival or a recovery. So is this possible? Could Jesus have simply gone into a coma, revived, and so let's look what happened to Jesus. Let's look at what the eyewitnesses said happened to him and think it through. Is it possible that Jesus wasn't dead and simply revived? So here are our arguments. First of all, we know that before Jesus was crucified, he was scourged. Matthew 27:26. And the scourging was not just a light whipping, it was very vicious, and the victim was usually stripped naked, and they were whipped with what was called a flagrum, which was a whip with multiple leather straps, and sometimes at the end of those straps there were little pieces of bone or stone or even metal. so that when the straps hit the body, those end bits would dig into the flesh, and as the whip was pulled back, they would dig out little bits of flesh and so on. And Bishop Eusebius of Caesarea, he describes not the scourging of Jesus, but a typical scourging. He says that often the veins of the victim were laid bare, and even the very muscles, sinews, and bowels of the victim were open to exposure. So this is not just, roughing up the skin, if you like, but this is digging in and pulling the flesh apart. So even the internal parts of the victim are now open to exposure. This was very severe. But when it comes to the scourging of Jesus, we know it was a particularly vindictive one. Because if you look into the Greek behind the sayings of what the soldiers were saying as they were doing, beating Jesus and so on, the Amplified Bible brings it out, the shade of meanings there. And as they were beating Jesus, they were saying things like, "Hail, King of the Jews." And that word hail can be translated as good health to you or long life to you. Now, think of that, someone beating someone and saying good health to you, and then beating them and saying long life to you and beating them. That shows there's incredible vindictiveness, there's sadism happening here. This wasn't just doing their job. They were kind of taking some sort of sadistic pleasure in mocking Jesus and doing this. So we know this was a severe scourging, not a light one. It was very, very severe. So much so, our next point is that Jesus, the records say Jesus was so weak, he couldn't carry the cross. And, Jesus was a strong person. He was a carpenter without any, mechanized tools and so on. Everything he had to do was by hand as a carpenter. And so he would have been a strong, muscular man. But now, after this severe beating, he's too weak to even carry the cross. And of course, then he's crucified. And again, we're familiar with crucifixion, but maybe just quickly explain some of the things that happened there. And there are some misconceptions about crucifixions. Our English Bibles say that the nails were driven through the hands and the feet, but history tells us, and even the Greek language tells us that most times the soldiers didn't crucify people, would put the nails through the palms, because the bone structure and muscle structure there is not strong enough to support the weight of the victim. Now, yes, sometimes they did tie the victim by their wrists and then put the nails through there to support them, but they were the exception to the rule. Most times the nails didn't go through the hands, the nails went through the bones of the wrist, just in here. And actually the Greek word that we have in our Bibles that says they nailed him through the hands, that word just doesn't mean the palm of the hand. It literally means the hand and the whole forearm area. So literally, it could well mean they nailed him through the wrists, which is what history tells us happened more often. And so the victim is nailed to the cross through nails through each wrist and then through the heels and so on. And of course, you imagine that if they allowed their weight to rest on their feet, that would cause excruciating pain in the feet that would, be unbearable. And so to escape that, they would pull up on their arms. But of course, that would put weight here, and that would be excruciating pain there. So imagine this torment of trying to, what do? Do you put your weight on your hands? Do you put your weight on your feet? And it just would have been horrific. And they tell us that after a period of time, the victim would start to cramp up, and the result of that was they wouldn't be able to pull themselves up or push themselves up. They'd just slump down in this position. And in that position, they could breathe in, but they couldn't exhale. So they would begin to actually suffocate. And medical experts tell us that in that process, that would help the cramps subside. They'd then be able to pull up again and breathe again. So crucifixion was, a loss of blood. It was gangrene. It was infection. It was exposure to the elements, but also it was a process of very slow suffocation. It was designed by the Romans to be the most torturous way to put someone to death. They deliberately made it that way as a threat to anybody. If you challenge us in our rule and dominance, then this will happen to you. And so they wanted to make this the slowest, most painful death they could devise, and that's what happened. So Jesus was crucified. Got a quote from Frederick Farrar about describing crucifix. I'll leave you to read that yourself. It's quite a long quote. But then we find our next point is the witnesses to the death of Jesus. They all pronounced him dead. So first of all, the soldiers say that Jesus was dead. Now, the Jews believed that if someone was left hanging on a tree or a cross, over the Sabbath, they'd be accursed of God, and so on. And so the Jewish leaders wanted these three people on the crosses, Jesus and the other two, to be brought down before sunset on this beginning of the Sabbath. And so let me just read that in John 19:31. Since it was the day of preparation, so that the bodies would not remain on the cross on the Sabbath. Verse 32, the soldiers came and broke the legs of the first and the other who had been crucified with him. But when they came to Jesus and saw he was dead, they did not break his legs. And so what they were doing there is normally crucifixion, people who are crucified would sometimes survive for 2 or 3 days. So this has only been 6 hours. And so these other two people on the right and left of Jesus were still alive. And what they were doing by breaking the legs, they were stopping the victim from pushing themselves up. So now they're slumped down and can't breathe out. And so within minutes, they would suffocate. That's what they would do. That's why they broke the legs, so they would suffocate. But when they come to Jesus, the soldiers, who are seasoned people who have done this many, many times, crucifixions were very common in this time. They come to Jesus, and because, breaking the legs is a bit hard, they see, no, he's dead, so they didn't bother doing it. And right there, the people who advocate the swoon theory go, there you go, there's proof. It was only 6 hours. It wasn't long enough for him to be dead, and they'd made a mistake. They didn't finish him off by breaking the legs. Therefore, he's only in this faint, and the account actually supports that they didn't kill him. Well, that might seem logical, but you've got to realize what else happened. They saved effort by not breaking the legs, but what did they do? What does the gospel accounts tell us? In John 19:34, it says, one of the soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear, and at once there came out blood and water. And so they were taking the easy way out here. They didn't want to have to go through the effort of breaking the legs, but they wanted to make sure this man, Jesus, was dead. So they thought he was dead, but just to check, they took a spear and pushed it up into his ribcage, into his side. And the witnesses said, out came blood and water. Now, they might not have understood what they were talking about there, but medical experts today tell us that when someone dies, their blood begins to separate into the red bits and the clear bits. That sounds very medical, doesn't it? And so the separation of the blood had begun in the life of Jesus, showing he was dead. That's one explanation. Other experts say that the fact that out came blood and water shows that the spear actually pierced into the sac of the heart, around the heart, and the clear fluid around the heart started to come out as well as the blood. And that could be a second reason why the blood and water was observed. But either way, it shows the victim was dead. And Samuel Horton, who's a doctor, he did experiments on corpses just to sort of validate these things. And his conclusion is this: he says, there remains therefore no supposition possible to explain the recorded phenomena of blood and water, is what he's talking about, except the combination of crucifixion and rupture of the heart. Then he goes on and talks about someone else who'd also looked at this from a modern medical point of view. He said the rupture of the heart was the cause of death of Christ is ably maintained by Dr. William Stroud, and that rupture of the heart actually occurred, I firmly believe. So although they didn't break the legs of Jesus, they didn't do that because they were convinced he was dead, but just to make sure, they speared him up into the heart, just to make sure. And the eyewitness accounts say blood and water came out, which modern medicine tells us he was really dead. Our next point is that everyone handling Jesus, for those who brought him down and those who prepared him for death, those who put him in the tomb, every one of them are convinced that he is dead. No one feels a pulse. No one sees him groan or hears him groan. He's totally dead as far as they are concerned. Everyone who handled him was convinced. So they then put him in the tomb. The Jewish authorities themselves were convinced he was dead. They didn't go, is he really dead so soon? No, they trusted the soldiers. The Jewish soldiers the Jewish leaders rather were concerned that someone was going to steal the body, not that Jesus was not dead. That's in Matthew 27:62. So then Jesus is placed in the tomb, and you think about it, someone's in a coma. The theory suggests that the tomb was cool and restful. Well, whether it was or not, we don't know. But if it was, that suggestion even works against the theory, because we know nowadays if someone's in a coma or someone's in shock, we don't cool them down. We actually warm them up, and that helps them revive. And so the theory itself is not medical on its advice that the tomb was cool and that revived Jesus, but we'll move on from that. Then he was wrapped in grave clothes, about 45 kilograms and so on. But more importantly, I suppose, the tomb was then sealed with a stone. And we know it was a large stone because the women coming to the tomb after the Sabbath, going to finalize the burial, spices and so on the body of Jesus, they were concerned that who was going to help them move the stone. It was very heavy and hard and so on. And then, of course, we've got the Roman soldiers. There was a guard placed on the tomb to stop this very thing happening, to stop people from stealing the body. And so, that shuts the door to the possibility of someone stealing, or Jesus. Let's forget the stealing the body at this stage, but it shows us that Jesus didn't somehow revive, roll away the stone, and then somehow, in this state of just surviving, now overtake Roman soldiers. There could be somewhere between 4 to 10 Roman soldiers. They are fully dressed, highly equipped with their swords, and highly trained and so on. To get out of the tomb, Jesus would have had to overcome them and so on in his weakened state and so on. It's just ridiculous to think he could have done that. And then, of course, Jesus is seen alive by witnesses, a whole range of them, up to 500 at one stage. And I've listed the mentions in the Bible of these people, but none of them offer first aid to him. No one in the upper room, they don't say to Jesus, Jesus, do you want to sit down? You're looking a bit weak here, and please stop dripping blood on the floor. No. He's looking robust. He's healthy. No one offers first aid. Now, over the years, I have a disease that pulls down my fingers. It's a disease that people with Viking blood evidently have in their system. And I've had each of these hands operated on twice each, 4 operations in total, by a plastic surgeon. And at one stage, in each hand, they did the hands at different times. I had up to 100 very, very small little stitches in the hands, and quite a massive amount of work in the hands, but done very carefully under sterile conditions and so on. Yet, my goodness, after these operations, these hands are so sore when the anesthetic wears off, and for days afterwards you can't do anything with them. There's no way you could do anything with, and these things seem to get more sore as time goes on before they really start to get better. So, and that's just a plastic surgeon doing it very carefully. This is not someone taking a rusty metal spike and ramming it through the wrists and the feet. This is not someone beating you to an inch of your life with your flesh all being pulled off by the whip and so on. Jesus underwent this incredible torture. This is not someone putting a spear up into the chest cavity and so on. If he had just gone into a coma and revived, he would have been in desperate need of major medical attention. It is ludicrous to think he could roll the heavy stone away. It's ludicrous to think he could overcome the soldiers and so on. And it's ridiculous to think then he could present himself to the disciples in this weakened state only days after this massive physical trauma, and stand before them and them not feel that he needs some sort of medical help. But no, he appears robust and healthy and well. In fact, there's one account in your notes there, I think it's in Luke's Gospel, where he walks 11 miles from Jerusalem to Emmaus with disciples and then has a meal with them. Then he quickly disappears, and then they go back to Jerusalem only to find Jesus there again. Jesus is healthier than he's ever been after the resurrection, which is not the way he would have been if he'd really just swooned and survived. The swoons theory doesn't stand up on all sorts of levels of scrutiny. Yet, it's something that's presented often to explain away the resurrection. They try to just say, well, Jesus really wasn't dead, therefore, the disciples were mistaken. They'd be willing to die now because they believe he'd risen from the dead, but in fact, it was a mistake. So our next one over the page is that the tomb was empty. So how else could we explain this tomb being empty? And the next idea is that someone stole the body. And so if that was the case, and we know, of course, it wouldn't have been the disciples who stole the body, because if they had stolen the body, they would have known that, and so they would have been lying about the resurrection. And we've already covered that no one dies for something they know is not true. So, we don't need to worry about did the disciples steal the body, but maybe someone else stole the body. Well, the arguments against someone else stealing the body, I think, are pretty straightforward. First of all, no one else really had a motive. Like, the only other groups of people are the Jews, and they certainly wouldn't have stolen the body and allowed the disciples to believe in a resurrection, because they were trying to stop Christianity. And they, in fact, organized a Roman guard to stop someone stealing the body. And, of course, the Romans would have had no motive to steal the body, because, that would have created more mischief, and they were just wanting peace in this, province, Palestinian province. And so for them, that wouldn't have, there's no motive for that. So no one's got a motive. And secondly, think about the Roman guards. They were there put to stop someone stealing the body. And the gospel accounts record that these disciples actually witnessed the angels, the resurrection, if you like, or at least the empty tomb, the stone rolled away. And they go to the religious leaders, and that's what they say happened. Their eyewitness accounts were that Jesus rose from the dead. But the Jewish authorities persuaded them to change their minds and say that they were asleep and someone stole the body while they were asleep. And why don't we believe that that's a possibility? Well, there's several reasons, I suppose. And the first one is to realize that Roman soldiers wouldn't go to sleep when they were on guard, because the penalty, they tell us, for sleeping on their watch was to be put to death themselves. In fact, they'd be stripped naked and their clothes would be taken to start a fire and they'd be burned alive. And so no one's going to volunteer, or no one's going to go to sleep. But hang on a minute, these guys volunteered and were willing to change their story from there was a resurrection to we were asleep. Wouldn't that put them in danger? Why would they change their story, we might argue, and now put themselves in danger? Well, I think what happened there was the religious leaders kind of blackmailed these soldiers into changing their story. Because could you imagine? They've been on guard all night. The tomb is now empty, and they go to their Roman superiors, and the superior says, "How come the body's gone?" There would be an assumption that the body was stolen. If they said, "Well, there was a resurrection," who's going to believe that? This pagan Roman commander, he's not going to believe that. He's going to go for the more natural explanation that someone stole the body, and therefore he's going to conclude that these soldiers are lying and that they must have been asleep, so they would be in big trouble. So these soldiers were, between a rock and a hard place. In fact, the Jewish authorities understand that, and notice what they say to them. Let's read that, and let's read Matthew 28:11. While they were going, behold, some of the guard went to the city and told the chief priests all that had taken place. They'd said what had taken place, a resurrection. Verse 12. When they had assembled with the elders and taken counsel, they gave a sufficient sum of money to the soldiers and said, "Tell his people, his disciples came by night and stole him away while we're asleep." They've changed their story. But why would they change it? Here it is, verse 14. "And if this comes to the governor's ears, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble." There's the answer. See, if they went alone with their story, claiming a resurrection, no one's going to believe that, and so they're going to die because it's assumed they're asleep. So if they were willing to change the story and say they were asleep, the Jewish authorities, who had some sway, at least with the commanders, would say, "Listen, it's all right." They were going to somehow make it right so they wouldn't die. So these guys were actually blackmailed into changing their story. That's why they were willing to take that risk. There was almost no option. So they did that. But secondly, when you think about the story that they were asleep, it kind of makes no sense. If they were asleep, they wouldn't have known what had happened. Indeed, a resurrection could have happened. They wouldn't know because they were asleep. So, when you tell a lie, sometimes it just doesn't work out. It hasn't got that ring of truth to it. And certainly this story that they were asleep doesn't make sense, because they then are not reliable witnesses as to what happened. So you couldn't rule out that a resurrection had happened because they were asleep. Well, very quickly, The argument against someone else stealing the body is very quickly answered by saying, well, what about all the resurrection appearances of Jesus? There were hundreds of people who claimed they had seen Jesus after the resurrection. Now, if the body had been stolen, sure, that explains the tomb being empty, but it doesn't explain all these people who claimed to see Jesus alive after his death and are now willing to die for that. They were totally convinced about it. So that's probably the biggest argument, that no one stole the body, is the fact that Jesus was seen after his death by people who were so convinced by it they were willing to die. Well, here's another theory. This one really is quite laughable, but it's out there, so we've got to address it. It was put forward by Professor Lake in the early 1900s, and he suggested that the disciples went to the wrong tomb, and therefore they went to an empty one and made a mistake, and mistakenly believed that Jesus had risen because they went to the wrong tomb. And he supports that by saying that the women who went to the tomb were emotional, they were teary and whatever, and got confused and went to the wrong place, came to the wrong conclusion, and therefore the story spread that Jesus had risen, where in fact he was still in the tomb. Well, it's just so simple to explain this one away. It's based upon the idea of what the angel said in Mark 16:6. The angel says to the woman, "Don't be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He's not here. See the place that they laid him." And so this professor suggests that the angels was pointing out to the women, he's not here. This is not where they laid him. But that's a self-defeating idea, and there's no scriptural support, because the whole verse actually, Professor Lake has omitted a bit of the verse, because the full verse in Mark 16:6 says, he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has risen. He's not here." And then also the verse goes on, "See the place where they laid him." So even if the women went to the wrong tomb, the angel still says he's risen, and also says that if that's the case, that's not the right tomb. See where they did lay him. The angel was redirecting them to the right tomb. So the theory has no grounds whatsoever. But just think of the logic. If the women went to the wrong tomb, that's one thing. But what about all the other people? This is supposing that no one else went to the real tomb. You got Peter and John supposedly go to the wrong tomb. You've got Joseph of Arimathea, who owns the tomb. He supposedly went to the wrong tomb as well. And I would imagine on the day of Pentecost, when Peter preaches that Jesus has risen from the dead, and that's only a 10-minute walk away from where the tomb was, I imagine many of those 8,000 converts on that day would have gone by that tomb just to check it out themselves. This would have been a major place to go and visit. So thousands of people, it seems, went to the wrong tomb. And then, of course, the Jewish leaders who wanted to stop Christianity, they could have done that by providing the body of Jesus, simply gone to the right tomb and brought the body out. But they didn't do that because they couldn't. So did they go to the wrong tomb as well? But then it gets so ludicrous when you think that there was a Roman guard stationed on the real tomb, and surely they would have directed people to the real tomb. Can you imagine? There's all this preaching about a resurrection from the dead and so on, and the soldiers are still standing at the right tomb guarding the one where Jesus' body is. Can you imagine them saying, "Hey, what's going on over there at that other tomb?" All those people going and looking, what's all that excitement about? "Oh, I don't know," as they're quietly guarding the real tomb. It just makes no sense that the women could have gone to the wrong tomb. So, we've got to cover it because it's raised every now and then, but there's no logic. And again, it doesn't explain these resurrection appearances of Jesus, because if they went to the wrong tomb, Jesus is still in the tomb, so there would be no resurrection appearances. Lastly, very quickly, the third, the next argument is to answer this idea of resurrection appearances and try and explain them away by the idea that they were hallucinations. Again, they're suggesting that people see what they wanted to see, especially if they were emotionally involved and so on. So, but you know what? Many of the disciples were not expecting to see a resurrection, although Jesus had told them. Over and over again, they didn't believe. And the one notable one is Thomas, who's the other 10 have said, "He's risen." He says, "No, I will not believe. This is not true until I touch him myself." He was not expecting a resurrection, yet when Jesus does appear and Jesus does touch, he cries out, "Lord and my God." He was a skeptic was convinced. It doesn't explain the number of witnesses that saw Jesus at the same time. Paul says there were over 500 who saw the resurrected Jesus at one time. People don't share hallucinations. It's just ridiculous. And you know what? At least one of the opponents, one of these witnesses whose life was totally changed, was an opponent of Christianity. This is Saul of Tarsus. He's not riding along on the road to Damascus looking for the resurrected Jesus. No, he's wanting to find Christians to put them in jail. And yet Jesus meets with him. He gets knocked off of his horse. He meets Jesus and is totally transformed because he's met the resurrected Jesus. He was a skeptic. He was an opponent of Christianity, and yet he's convinced he's now seen him alive from the dead. And of course, the last thing that convinces me it wasn't an hallucination is if it was a hallucination, then the tomb wasn't empty and they could have produced the body of Jesus, and that would have, as we've said many times, simply shut down Christianity. But they couldn't do it because the real tomb was empty, and therefore we know these people weren't hallucinating. You know, whenever you look at any of the arguments that have been put forward to suggest the disciples were sincere but sincerely wrong, they'd simply made mistakes, the theories don't make sense. The fact that he went into a coma, supposedly went into a coma or swooned, makes no sense medically. The fact that people went to the wrong tomb is just ridiculous. The fact that people maybe hallucinated the resurrected Jesus makes no sense whatsoever. So, you know, looking at all the different possibilities explaining away the resurrection, none of them make sense at all. The only conclusion is that Jesus really did rise from the dead, and that's it. That's why we have Christianity today. I'm so glad we can think through these issues, and there are good, reliable, logical answers to explain the theories that have been put forward to explain away the resurrection. Well, we've run out of time again. Let's just quickly pray before we finish today. Father, we thank you so much for your word. We thank you that it is reliable. And when we even put it up to scrutiny to see whether maybe the disciples got things wrong or misunderstood what had happened or were lying or whatever, there are logical answers that just show us that no, these people were telling the truth, and also they were not mistaken because any other explanation makes no sense. Father, we thank you again that we can see the reliability of your word. Help us to understand these truths and help us to be able to communicate these with people who need to know why we believe in a resurrection of Jesus. And again, Holy Spirit, we thank you and we honor you in Jesus' name. Amen.